that's basically it. Just basically wanted to make sure that you got a nice even cover, that you don't see any blotchy spots. The wood soaks it up pretty fast, so if you want to go really dark, if you were just doing an actual colored finish, I'd probably do another coat, but just gonna let this dry. It takes a couple hours, and then we're gonna sand it back with the 220. So we'll be back in a bit after this dries. So here's the body ready for the flat clear coat. Basically what happened with that first coat that I put onto the dye that you guys saw, it actually soaked in a lot deeper than I thought it would. So I had to sand the whole body with the 180 grit actually, and then the 220, and it took an incredibly long time, about 3 to 4 hours, not even exaggerating. I did it by hand. Obviously a power sander wouldn't be able to get the details as well around these curves and in these cracks and stuff, so I wanted to make sure that I didn't mess it up, so I did it by hand. So this is what it looked like after that sanding. It didn't come out exactly how I thought it was going to. I don't know if it's just this piece of wood that they've used, but the grain was very splotchy. So that gave me another idea, and I thought I could go for this vintage worn type of look. And the way I accomplished that was by, after that, sanding that down that first time, wipe it off with mineral spirits, and then I basically made a mixture of watered down dye. I just kept trying it, kept adding the dye until it was the right shade I wanted. Then I went over the whole guitar again, and then let that dry. Then I sanded it with the 320 grit, and this is what we are wound up with here. So it's this really cool, like grayish weathered look. It doesn't look as good as it's gonna look when it's finished right now, just because it doesn't have the coat on there, but when I wiped it down with the mineral spirits, it looked awesome. And I also decided to give it a black binding. So I just taped it again and then went over it a second time with the non-watered down dye. So we got this nice black binding all the way around also. So overall, I'm really excited. I think it's gonna look really cool. This is essentially what I was going for. I just wanted that grain to be accented with a little bit of a black tin on there. I left inside the knob holes black because the knob's gonna cover that, and that was a real pain to try and sand down in deep there. So basically the next step is to attach the neck. I want to attach the neck before I put the poly on. That's how PRS does it. I think maybe that's because it helps bind the neck to the guitar and make that seal even stronger. We're gonna use Gorilla Glue. This is a PVA wood glue, which stands for polyvinyl acetate. It's the strongest type of wood glue you can get. So we're gonna be using that, and a clamp. And it's basically spread the glue all around in the neck joint. So we wanna get it all inside here, up on the sides. And we're gonna pop the neck in, clamp it down, wipe off the extra, and let it set. So I'm gonna go work on that, and we'll be back once that's done. All right, so now we have the neck permanently attached. I actually wound up going with 2 clamps. Here's a couple pictures just to show you guys how I did it. I cut a wood block that was the width of the neck to put in there. That way it would spread the clamp pressure evenly, make sure we get a nice tight seal, get the glue all spread around. And when you do that and you clamp down, you're gonna get a bunch of that glue seeping out all around here. So you just take a Q-tip with some warm water, get the spare glue off. However, wood likes to absorb water and glue too, apparently. So I had to go back once it was dry and just sand around this seal here. Also on the bottom of the neck joint, get that glue off. Something else I noticed, again, we're talking about $100 parts here. The neck is not perfectly straight in terms of where they routed out the pickup holes. I took a string and put it in the center, pulled it tight down the middle, and it was slightly off center with where the pickup holes are. So fortunately, there's some wiggle room. I took one of the pickups in the rings, and there's enough room for me to shift them so that I can bring it in line. But that's something that you guys should, when you go to glue your neck in, if possible, you might be able to hold the body and slightly shift the neck. Try and make sure you can get that as centered as possible before the glue dries on you. And then lastly, I took off the crappy nut that came on it, so that's gone, but you can see how much space is left because their nut was so wide compared to the PRS nut. So what I have to do before I put the clear coat on now is essentially make a template, mask off the bottom of this, cut that and stick it on here, so that way when I put the clear on after it's done, I could take that tape off and I'll have the raw wood there just wide enough for the nut to be attached to. So the next step is to put that clear coat on. You basically just apply it with a foam brush, about 4 to 6 coats I think I'm going to do. We'll see once we get into it. Not going to film that. Basically clear coating anything with a foam brush is really straightforward. You just put it on as thin as possible. Also, I need to do the fretboard as well. We're going to clear coat this whole thing, and that's because this is a raw maple fretboard. And if you don't put some type of protective finish on there, that's going to get really gross looking and dirty as you play it. So essentially, we're going to put the clear over the whole thing, which is going to be on the frets. After it's done and dry, we're going to mask off the fretboard, and then you just take some steel wool and brush the clear coat off of the frets. But we'll document that when we get there. So I'm going to go ahead and start the clear coat. So the body is now completely finished. Wound up going with 7 coats on the body, 5 coats on the fretboard, and 6 coats on the neck and the headstock. And the reason I went with 7 on the body, not 6, was because on the 6th coat I put it on too thick and it didn't dry flat, so I had to sand it and do a 7th one to get the nice finish. So I only went with 5 on the fretboard just because I didn't want to have the product building up too much and lose that depth between the frets. So overall, I'm really happy with the way it looks. The finish itself came out exactly how I wanted it to, which is just very low shine, built up nice, so it's going to offer good protection there. However, applying it was very challenging in the way that there seems to be this like perfect amount of too thick or not thick enough that when you're putting it on, if it's too thick, it'll kind of dry uneven, and if it's too thin, you end up getting these weird discolored lighter looking spots when it dries. It doesn't all blend together and dry nice. So it definitely took some trial and error to figure out where that sweet spot is. I suppose maybe if you thinned it with some water, it would make it a little easier. However, another problem I ran into specifically on the top, these curves, was trying to get the product to the right thickness without it running and drying that way. So overall, even despite it was being difficult to work with, it looks exactly the way that I wanted to, so I'm very happy there. On the fretboard, the finish came out perfect, and I actually already went down and with some quad zero steel wool, I wiped down all the frets just to give them more of a natural wood feel, which also then took off the finish that got onto the frets, so everything is clean there. And to be honest, I actually steel wooled everything. I did the body, the back of the neck, everything, just because it kind of dulled the shine a little bit more and also helped level the finish. And the other thing I was telling you guys about before, so there's that piece of tape. So I put it on the back of the fretboard and on the bottom of the headstock, so that's what I cut there. That basically mirrors the PRS nut. So in a minute here we're gonna take that off, and we'll have the natural wood for the nut to attach to. Each coat I basically waited 2 hours in between, let it dry, sand it with 320. The last 2 coats in between, after sanding with 320, I also buffed it with the steel wool to try to help smooth it out as much as possible. As far as the process that I used, I basically did the back of the neck, and then the sides of the headstock and all the sides of the guitar at one time. Would let that dry, then I'd flip it over, do the top of the headstock, the body, and then the frets. I just repeated that process over and over again. Alright, so it's time to take the tape off for the nut. So I just got an X-Acto knife. Basically, we just want to follow along the edge there and cut through the finish so we can get the tape off. And hopefully it'll come right off. Let's check and see if the nut fits. And that's pretty much perfect. Alright, so now it's time to start assembling the rest of the pieces. So the first thing I'm going to do is the truss rod cover. So I just have the nut set there for now. Not going to attach that till we get the bridge and everything in, to make sure it's aligned perfectly. So just going to press this up against here, eyeball it, make sure that it is centered. And make a little mark. And then got some tape on the drill bit just to make sure that we don't go in too deep. And then take the plastic off. Alright, so do the same thing with the tuners. Just basically just drop into the holes. And then we need to make sure that they're all straight and then mark them so that we can drill the holes. Alright, so one came out a little crooked, this middle one. So the way that you can slightly shift holes small amounts is by taking a toothpick So unfortunately my iPhone ran out of storage space when I was installing the tuners and I didn't notice, so I got cut off there, but they are now fully installed. So I believe where it cut out, we were just marking and drilling and attaching them on the back here. After that, all you have to do is just put the washer around and then the hex nut, you screw that down, get everything nice, tight and snug. So those are all in and looking good. What I started to talk about at the end when I got cut off was a trick that I've learned. So when you're drilling stuff like this, and it has to be very precise, these are small screws, very small holes. Even when you try and mark them as best you can, sometimes once you finally screw it down, you'll find that it's just very, very slightly off. So what you can do is just take a toothpick and you just break off the tip of it. So this is tapered. So then you stick that into the hole that you drilled, and then that way, this is a softer wood, and with the taper it gives some room in the bottom. It allows the screw to go on one side of it, which will then slightly shift whatever it is that you're mounting. So that's a good tip to make very fine adjustments if you're just slightly off on where you drilled out your holes. In addition to the tuners, I've also put the pickups in. The way that I lined this up was starting at the neck pickup. Got a ruler, and I basically just measured on both sides of the neck, make sure that the pickup was perfectly centered, and then also push forward and flush and perfectly in line with the neck. Once I had that attached, then I went down, put this in place, used the ruler, and pushed up on the top pickup, which then by default was squaring this pickup perfectly in line with that one, which this one is in line with the neck. So now they're both perfectly in line with each other and square with the neck. So you just basically screw those down and the wires run through the cavity. I taped them so that it would be easier to feed through the rough wood in there. So now these are sitting here ready to go for the rest of the wiring. So something I figured out once I finally opened up that pack of wiring, since this cavity, like we said earlier, is routed smaller than an actual PRS, this 5-way switch, which is not a PRS 5-way switch that came in that package, actually won't fit in here where that is supposed to go. So I did research, found out online that the actual PRS switch, which is this, since it's flat, it does fit in there, and it actually makes the wiring a lot easier. If you're gonna go with this 5-way switching system, this one is just the standard 5-way switch, which just has your top and bottom wiring tiers. And when I started researching how to wire this kind of switch the way the PRS does it, it's actually really difficult and was very confusing. So it's kind of like a blessing in disguise that this didn't fit, because I then found out that the PRS one is super easy. It's just got your treble pickup, bass pickup, it tells you the color and the wire where it's going, then your tone pot volume, everything is marked and super easy to wire. So I got this on eBay for 50 bucks. It's 80 on their website, but to me it's worth the price just in making the wiring easy. Never mind the fact that I had to do it anyway for the guitar to fit. Oh, and then something else that I also noticed, so you can see we've got the part on the top here where the knob goes, and then the threads. The size holes that they routed out in this are too small, so it doesn't fit through the threads through. So I'm gonna have to drill those holes out wider so the threads will fit on all the knobs, so that I can get those mounted in there properly. So now I'm ready to do this last little bit of work here before we move on to the bridge and attaching the nut. I'm actually going to pay my friend to do the bridge because I don't have a drill press and he does, and he's experienced with that, so I just want to make sure the bridge is perfectly in line. So I'm going to have him do that. So all I have left to do is just drill and mount the strap locks and then do the wiring and mount that stuff and put the knobs on. So I'm going to get everything together here, and then I'm going to do filming of the wiring, and I'll put a diagram up on screen so you guys can see where everything's going and how to do it. Something else that's important to mention that I forgot to say is I talked about switching out pickup rings for those Gibson ones because that's what was on my original PRS. I'm not sure what's different about these copy parts, but those pickup rings wouldn't work, and I'll show you why. So luckily, since I had those shallow PRS ones, you can see here that's just the right height that I can get the pickups low enough that the strings will be able to get over them and get to the bridge. The thicker Gibson ones were so much taller that the strings would have ran into them. So either that or the bridge would have had to be so high that my action would have been ridiculous. So however they've designed these parts, or the height of the neck and the fretboard, I'm not sure what the difference is, but you have to go with those PRS general pickup rings, the lower flat ones, in order for the pickups to be at the correct height.